Welcome to the OutSystems Mobile Patterns Design lesson. In this lesson, we'll cover these topics, including a brief overview of SilkUI patterns and their advantages. Then, we'll briefly revisit some architecture considerations, namely where the pattern should be stored. Next, we'll introduce the types of patterns with some properties and behaviors that can influence their complexity, followed by an introduction to the different ways that we can build a new pattern. Finally, we'll cover some preview-only cues that can be used in the editor canvas inside of Service Studio that will help you design new patterns. SilkUI patterns are reusable UI elements typically implemented in OutSystems using blocks. These UI patterns have a standard structure that addresses common application use cases and can be reused throughout any application by simply dragging and dropping them to your canvas. Each SilkUI pattern is different and has different and specific functionalities. These blocks should therefore restrict themselves to what is required to make the pattern work. They should not include business logic or specific design elements such as colors or typography. By leveraging and reusing these patterns, you can greatly speed up the process of developing enterprise applications. As an individual and a team, developers become familiar with these patterns and therefore make fewer mistakes as they're developing. These patterns can become a common visual language with your team, and they can improve general understanding, code readability, and promote common and proper conventions. Regarding the architecture of your applications, it's important to note that patterns should be stored in their own module, isolated from the business logic and the themes of the application. As mentioned before, the patterns should be agnostic to the business logic, but also from the themes. Since they're typically based on blocks, they can be reused in any application regardless of their themes. Patterns can be split into two main categories, simple and advanced. Simple patterns include more basic concepts and elements such as placeholders, containers, CSS classes, and an icon and description. Regarding advanced patterns, these will mix multiple and more complex behaviors. Each one of the following types is more complex than the previous on the list. UI patterns, which have custom styles defined that are set by input parameters, can make the look and feel more dynamic. UI with JavaScript patterns are more complex than the previous in that they rely not only on input parameters, but also on JavaScript elements in OutSystems client actions. Simple interaction patterns will also combine events with JavaScript and input parameters. Advanced interaction patterns use a combination of simple logic and JavaScript elements based on actions and event listeners. We'll cover some basics of each of these patterns, but let's start with the UI pattern. The UI patterns have basic defaults according to the native look and feel. The input parameters of these patterns allow setting some custom styles. In this example, we have the counter pattern. Let's suppose that you'd like to create a pattern with a height that can be dynamically set. This is possible using the input parameters and setting the value at design time. Internally, this pattern uses the input parameter to dynamically set the look and feel. So here in this expression, you can see if the value of the height is greater than 0, we set the pattern height in the style. Otherwise, we default the style to the basic look and feel. In the UI with JavaScript pattern, along with input parameters, JavaScript is used to provide additional and more advanced behaviors. The example shown here uses JavaScript to toggle the visibility of the action sheet based on the value of the isOpen input parameter. Here's an example of a simple interaction where events are used. The section expandable pattern from the SilkUI patterns triggers the onToggle event whenever the content is expanded or collapsed. So whenever the title area is clicked, the content expands or collapses and the event is triggered. The input parameter isExpanded is used to control whether the content will be shown or hidden. Now let's take a quick look at tabs, an example of an advanced interaction pattern. In this example, the input parameter starting tab is used to select which tab will be shown by default. When a tab is clicked, or if the user holds and drags to move between tabs, the tab will change. Internally, the pattern uses JavaScript to control gestures and input parameters to keep track of the current tab. There can be scenarios where the SilkUI patterns are not enough, and you may want to create or customize your own patterns. In OutSystems, there are 3 ways to build a pattern, and the one that you would choose depends on the complexity of the requirements. First, we can adapt a pattern. This scenario happens when we want a pattern that already exists, but maybe with different styling. This means that we can customize an existing pattern at the first level of the CSS. Second, we can extend an existing pattern. This scenario happens when we want to build a pattern where a similar or subcase of the pattern already exists. This means that we can create a new pattern by reusing those existing patterns with some extra customization such as new placeholders and JavaScript elements. Finally, we can also build our own pattern from scratch. Your extended patterns are based on existing SilkUI patterns. So depending on the UI complexity of these existing patterns and on which changes that you wish to make, this process may be very simple or very complex. Extending various patterns and difficulty levels can be found in some of the other mobile pattern lessons. To build a new pattern, you should start by creating a new application in Service Studio where the pattern will be defined. This should be a new application to avoid interfering with your Patterns module where you may have other patterns already defined. Then, in this new application, define a new module and create a new block. Implement your pattern in this block, including any custom JavaScript, CSS, or actions with functional logic. If the pattern has any input parameters, it's important to use the existing naming conventions when defining them. Remember to document your pattern by writing descriptions for the block, its parameters, and placeholders, and be sure to test your pattern along the way. Of those descriptions, remember the placeholder descriptions are shown in the editor canvas itself. These type of developer hints are extremely helpful, so remember to add these placeholder descriptions and test often to make sure that they can be properly viewed. Additionally, there are other visual cues that can be added for previewing purposes in the editor canvas. This is specifically important for patterns without any UI, so there's a visualization of the pattern in the canvas, but it's also important for patterns with a UI as well. For previewing purposes, Service Studio always displays the true branch of an instantiated block. You can take advantage of this behavior for displaying visual cues. The best practice to accomplish this is to use always false if widgets to display those visual cues where the condition is simply false and the true branch has some preview content, such as an icon or image. Since Service Studio always displays the true branch of an instantiated block, when using the pattern, the preview content will be displayed in the editor canvas. Since the if condition is false at runtime, the content displayed is the one defined in the false branch of the if widget. In this case, the end user of the application will only see the content of the false branch at runtime. This leads to two different kinds of possible behaviors depending on if the pattern does or does not have a UI. For patterns without UI, such as SilkUI's touch events, the false branch of the if widget would be empty, while the true branch would have a preview icon or image. For patterns with UI, such as the SilkUI's floating content, the true branch would still have some preview content, but the false branch actually has the UI implementation of the patterns, such as placeholders, widgets, or other patterns. There are also preview-only visual cues that can be applied to CSS classes. Consider this example. With the container CSS class applied to a container in the screen, the Service Studio vendor prefix can be used inside CSS to apply preview-only visual cues inside of Service Studio. In the editor canvas, we can see the container does not have any border around it, as you can see here in the top image. However, as you can see in the bottom image, the browser at runtime will display the border. When you're done creating your pattern, there are two final things that you should consider. First, since the pattern was created in a new application, copy the block to the Patterns module. Then, the custom CSS should be moved to the theme style sheet, which is in its own module. The Patterns module should only have the blocks with the pattern structure and no other elements. An exception is the preview-only CSS definitions, such as the ones with the Service Studio vendor prefix.